The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It's pretty good, that's my capsule review. Anyone who was waiting on word from Chiropolis before diving in, well, I say to you non-existent people, take the plunge, it's not bad. But there is one minor issue I did notice, a tiny downer, and that is loading times. Kind of frustrating when you die having to wait, but I bought this game on cartridge. Aren't they supposed to be faster, instant even? That was the boast of cart-based systems way back when, and it was mostly true. So what happened? Why have we regressed? You see, this isn't a cartridge. No, it might look like one, but it's not. But this is a cartridge. It's even got the Macho Man on the front. Let the cream rise to the top. But this isn't some weird retro gaming flex, it's not some old man shouts at cloud style rant, no, there's something fundamentally different about these two, so different you might argue that they are not the same thing. So with an NES cartridge, when you plug it into the NES, the ROM chips, the bit where the game data is stored, links up directly to the CPU. It's memory mapped into the CPU address space. A fancy way of saying it doesn't load the game from the cartridge into the NES's memory. The cartridge is the memory. The NES runs the game straight from the cartridge. No middleman needed, no loading. On the Switch though, when you plug in a cartridge, well, it doesn't run it directly from there. It has to load the game into the Switch's 4GB of RAM before you can play it. And of course, this is not the only way that you can play Switch games. You can go the download route and install the game either onto the internal flash memory or store it on an SD card. And these two methods might actually be a bit faster than cartridges, but the same thing applies. The game needs to be loaded from here into the memory before you can play it. So why this fundamental difference? Why not make Switch cartridges like NES cartridges and have instant loading? Surely that would be a great feature to be able to boast about. Well, let's take a closer look at an NES cartridge and how it connects to the rest of the system. We've got address pins and data pins which link the ROM directly to the CPU, and it reads data from here just the same as if it was reading it directly from internal RAM built into the system. The data from ROM chips can be supplied as fast as the CPU can handle it, and just plugging the cartridge in loads in the game data effectively. The NES is a bit unusual though, it goes a stage further. It's got a sort of double cartridge. It's not just the CPU that links up with the ROM chips inside, but also the PPU, the graphics chip. There's more address pins and data pins in the cartridge that are for graphics data, called character ROMs. With an NES cartridge, the PPU has direct access to graphics data. Again, as fast as it can handle it, the data is there. Why do it this way? Well, it's not just faster, but it's also cheaper, at least for Nintendo. The NES had just 4KB of RAM, which reduced the cost of the system to manufacture, even if it did mean cartridges would have to be a bit more expensive. The upshot of this is that, well, NES games don't need to load much of anything at all, and the amount of data involved is so small that when it does happen, well, it's so quick you won't realise, even with games that have extra RAM built into them, as some do. If we take a look at the Super NES, things get slightly more complicated. We still have ROM chips mapped directly into the CPU's memory, so lots of the data doesn't need to be loaded anywhere else, it can be just sucked up directly from the cart. The Super NES though has a lot more RAM storage internally used for various functions outside of that, so there is quite a lot of data that does need to go from the cartridge to this memory as the game is running. And once you've included enhancement chips, there can be 10 times the RAM that you get with the NES or more. It's still so quick you might not notice it, but there's a lot more loading going on in Super NES games in the background. Interestingly though, the ROM chips in Super NES carts don't necessarily operate as fast as the CPU can possibly handle. Cartridges in fact come in two flavours, slow and fast, the slow ones being cheaper to make. And that doesn't just mean things load more slowly. The way the ROMs are integrated directly into the CPU's memory map means that the CPU actually has to run slower when it's accessing this slower ROM memory, which reduces performance. If we move on to the next generation with the N64, things start to get a bit weird. Yes, of course, the N64 had cartridges. That was its foil and its saving grace. They couldn't store as much as a CD, nowhere near, but they were much faster, right? Instant loading? Well, maybe not, but extremely fast loading? Absolutely. You see, the ROM chips in an N64 cartridge are still memory mapped into the CPU address space. The CPU can access the data stored there directly, but it's actually quicker to read it from the N64's 4.5 megabytes of RAM. Most of the time when games are running, they are loading from the cartridge into this RAM. It's not reading them directly from the cartridge anymore. The cartridge isn't the memory. In fact, the N64 worked more like a disc-based system with a really fast drive than it did like the NES or the Super NES. It's very quick, but the N64 loads lots and lots of data when it's running games. And some N64 games, well, they do have noticeable pauses for loading, but still things happen fast enough that for the most part, you might not realise what is happening. But when we get into the 2000s, when we get to Nintendo's next cartridge-based system, their biggest selling cartridge-based system, the biggest selling cartridge system, full stop, the change is complete. The data in DS carts is not memory mapped. The CPU doesn't have direct access to it. It's got to load it all into the system's RAM before it can do anything with it at all. And these cartridges, well, they look a bit like, and in fact are closely related to SD cards, the technology that was very much gaining ground when the DS came out. In fact, certain widely adopted unofficial accessories used solely for legitimate homebrew apps, I'm quite sure, well, they were basically adapters that let you run games straight from SD cards. The key is, unlike previous generations of cartridges, these DS carts, they send data in serial format, not in parallel. They send data as a stream of single bits rather than in blocks. Why? Well, as technology progressed, it became cheaper, electrically simpler, and made cartridges smaller and more reliable. The 3DS and the Switch carried on with this. Their cartridges aren't compatible, but they work in much the same way. They're much more like modern memory cards than old school cartridges in every possible way. So have we gone backwards then? Are things getting slower? Well, no, the throughput of a Switch game card is far, far more than any old school cart. It's just that the size of games, the speed of CPUs, the amount of data they can handle has increased even faster, so they can't quite keep up. Would it really be that hard to make a cartridge system these days that worked like an old school one where the game data was mapped directly into the CPU's memory, giving us the joy of instant loading? Well, yes, it would be quite difficult. Take a look at this picture of the memory interface on a Switch motherboard. These tracks are what connect the Switch's RAM to the CPU, a parallel connection. See how bizarrely wiggly they are? That's because they all have to be precisely the same length, so that the signal takes the exact same amount of time to get down each track. If they weren't, the bits at the very high transfer rate that this uses would get out of sync and the data would be garbled, the kind of little detail that's become critical in modern high-performance systems. Imagine trying to design that level of precision into a cartridge that you can just plug into a slot. It's probably not literally impossible, yet RAM sticks are a thing, but it would be tough to make a practical, reliable cartridge cheaply that would work fast enough. And yes, there's plenty of other reasons too why this would be a stupid idea. It's just totally impractical today. Software operating systems, they don't work like that anymore. And yes, Evercade cartridges aren't proper old school cartridges either. I think they're literally SD cards in a different form factor. Some commentators seemed surprised that the Switch was going to use cartridges when it was first announced, but it makes perfect sense now, though it's hard to imagine any kind of disc working with the Switch. I still like cartridges, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, not least because it's cheaper to buy the cart version of most games than the download version for some unfathomable business reasons. So yes, this isn't a cartridge, and yes, okay, the answer was there all along. It's a game card, that's what Nintendo calls it, and it's fundamentally a different thing than the cartridge technology that dominated in the 80s and 90s. Atari, Sega, Commodore and all the rest, they all used them, but the last one standing in the cartridge world, at least in mainstream gaming, well, that's not really a cartridge. And okay, perhaps this video really was just an excuse to capture Tears of the Kingdom footage. Yeah, okay, I'm not the first person out the gate with this news, but it is quite good. And also the as yet unpatched duplication glitch is pretty insane. There's been some game-breaking bugs in first-party Nintendo stuff before, but usually just literally game-breaking, not render mechanics pointless sort of game-breaking. And if you haven't seen this, well, the most refined version of this glitch is just select items to hold whilst you're in the air and then press Y and B, and now you've got twice as many as you did before. Anyway, let's leave that there. Thank you, as ever, to my wonderful Patreons, this stout body of fine supporters. There's a link below if anyone else would like to join them. And I'll say, well, you know, as a change of pace, here's a Japanese tongue twister. Sumomomomomo, momomomomomo, sumomomomomo, momomo, no chi. Sumomomomomo, momomomomo, sumomomomomo, momomo, no chi. Well, I hope that has enriched your day. Goodbye, and thanks for watching. And yes, it seems as I'm just finishing up this video, that glitch has been patched. Nintendo giveth, Nintendo taketh away. But hey, it was fun while it lasted.